The war did not end with silence. In the spring of 1945, as Berlin burned and the Reich collapsed into ash, millions of German soldiers laid down their weapons before the advancing Red Army. Among them were men in black uniforms marked by runes that had once promised power and now invited vengeance. The SS prisoners did not march into captivity with any illusion of mercy. They crossed a threshold into a different war, one without front lines or ceasefires, where time itself became a weapon. What followed was not merely imprisonment, but a reckoning stretched across frozen camps, ruined cities, and years stolen from human lives. If you want more stories that confront history at its darkest edges, where victory and suffering blur into something far more tragic, consider supporting this channel. It helps keep these forgotten voices from disappearing into silence. The moment of surrender did not arrive like peace, it came like exposure. In the final weeks of the war, as the Third Reich collapsed inward on itself, the world the SS had known dissolved with terrifying speed. Orders stopped arriving, radios fell silent, cities that had been promised to stand for 1,000 years burned in a matter of days. When the Red Army broke through the last defensive lines and Berlin became a grave of stone and smoke, surrender was no longer a choice made with dignity. It was something that happened to men who were already hollowed out by defeat. For the SS, the knowledge of who was coming mattered more than the fact that the war was ending. Stories traveled faster than armies. They moved from mouth to mouth, whispered in cellars, murmured in foxholes, carried by refugees who had seen what happened when Soviet troops reached German soil. Tales of executions, beatings, and revenge killings were not dismissed as propaganda. Too many had already seen enough to know that hatred did not disappear with a ceasefire. It sharpened. When SS units began to surrender in large numbers, they often did so in confusion and terror. Some tried to discard their insignia, ripping runes from collars, burying black uniforms beneath civilian coats, hoping to pass as ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers. Others surrendered openly, rigid with discipline even in defeat, clinging to the last fragments of identity because abandoning them felt worse than death. Neither choice guaranteed survival. The Red Army had learned to recognize the SS by posture, by accent, by the way men carried themselves even when stripped of rank. At the point of capture, the war did not feel finished. Soviet soldiers stood before men they believed had brought annihilation to their homeland. Villages burned, families starved, entire regions erased. The SS uniform was not just clothing, it was an accusation. Many prisoners were beaten at the moment of surrender, not as punishment ordered from above, but as something instinctive, almost ritualistic. Rifle butts struck ribs, boots found faces. Some men were shot outright, their bodies left where they fell, uncounted and unmourned. Those who survived the first hours quickly understood that captivity under the Soviets was not governed by the same expectations that applied in the West. There were no clean processing centers, no careful documentation, no assurances of treatment under international law. Prisoners were disarmed, searched, herded together, and marched away from the front lines almost immediately. Food was scarce or non-existent. Water came from ditches and melted snow. The wounded were rarely separated from the healthy. Anyone who collapsed risked being left behind. Fear settled in with a physical weight. Men whispered at night about what awaited them further east. Some believed they would be executed en masse. Others imagined years of imprisonment, but clung to the hope that survival was possible. A few still convinced themselves that the Soviets would distinguish between degrees of guilt, between those who had committed atrocities and those who had merely worn the uniform. That belief did not last long. As columns of prisoners formed and began moving eastward, it became clear that surrender was only the beginning of something far worse. Guards did not hurry. There was no urgency to reach camps or destinations. Time itself became a tool. Marches stretched endlessly through ruined towns and across fields churned into mud by artillery. Civilians watched from doorways and roadsides, some in silence, others spitting, shouting curses or throwing stones.
These were not anonymous captives, they were symbols of devastation walking past the wreckage they had helped create. Hunger arrived quickly. Whatever rations prisoners had carried at the moment of capture were gone within days. Soviet supplies were barely sufficient for their own troops, let alone for enemies. Men learned to chew grass, to scrape frozen earth in search of roots, to fight one another over scraps tossed carelessly from carts. Disease followed hunger as predictably as night follows day. Dysentery spread, fever took hold, lice thrived in unwashed clothing. Death became familiar long before any camp gates came into view. The SS prisoners were watched more closely than others. Guards lingered near them longer, insults were more personal, beatings were more frequent and less restrained. Some Soviet soldiers made no effort to hide their hatred. They spoke of villages erased, of families shot, of regions erased by murder. The SS prisoners did not argue. They could not. Words had lost their power here. Only bodies spoke, and bodies spoke in exhaustion and wounds. To survive the first hours quickly understood that captivity under the Soviets was not governed by the same expectations that applied in the West. There were no clean processing centers, no careful documentation, no assurances of treatment under international law. Prisoners were disarmed, searched, herded together, and marched away from the front lines almost immediately. Food was scarce or non-existent. Water came from ditches and melted snow. The wounded were rarely separated from the healthy. Anyone who collapsed risked being left behind. By the time the first makeshift holding areas came into view, the prisoners were already changed. Faces hollowed, eyes dulled, movements slowed. The illusion that surrender meant safety had been burned away. What replaced it was a grim understanding that captivity under the Soviets was not an interlude before returning home. It was a sentence without a known length, handed down not by a judge, but by history itself. And this was only the beginning. Night fell without ceremony. There were no fires allowed, no gatherings, no prayer spoken aloud. The prisoners slept where they stopped, bodies pressed together on frozen ground or damp earth, sharing what little warmth remained in human flesh. The sounds that carried through the darkness were not the heroic echoes of a defeated army, but coughing, quiet sobbing, and the dull thud of someone convulsing in fever. Every so often, a single shot cut through the night, sharp and final, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow breath itself. No one asked who had been shot. Everyone already understood why questions were dangerous. By morning, the dead were obvious. Some lay stiff and pale, mouths open as if caught mid-breath. Others looked almost peaceful, exhaustion finally having finished what hunger and fear had begun. The living were forced to drag the bodies to the side of the road or into shallow ditches. There were no markers, no names recorded. These men vanished not into graves, but into statistics that would later be debated, minimized, or weaponized by those who never walked these roads. As the days passed, something subtle but irreversible happened. The SS prisoners stopped thinking in terms of rescue or release. Time no longer stretched forward to an imagined end. It collapsed inward, becoming a series of immediate calculations. How many steps until the next halt? How long until thirst became unbearable? Whether the guard watching them was bored, angry, or simply empty. Survival narrowed the mind until ideology, loyalty, even hatred lost their shape. What remained was endurance stripped of meaning. Occasionally, a Soviet officer appeared, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning faces with professional detachment. These moments brought a different kind of terror. Names were called, questions about rank, unit, location during certain operations. Men hesitated, lied, contradicted themselves. Some were pulled aside and never seen again. Others were beaten until they confessed to things they had not done, or until they remembered things they wished they could forget. Truth became fluid, shaped by pain and fear rather than facts. Rumors hardened into belief. It was said the SS would never go home, that they would work until their bodies failed and then be buried where they fell. that the Soviets intended to make them pay, not only for what they had done, but for what Germany had been. Whether these stories were true mattered less than the effect they had. Hope became dangerous. Men who clung to it too fiercely often broke first. The landscape itself seemed to participate in the punishment. Ruined towns offered no shelter, fields were stripped bare, rivers were crossed without bridges, boots filling with icy water that never truly dried again. The smell of decay followed the columns, a mixture of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and death carried in the folds of clothing. Even the air felt hostile, heavy with smoke and the memory of destruction. By the time the prisoners were herded into more permanent holding areas, whatever remained of their former selves had been ground down by exhaustion. The SS identity that had once granted power now functioned like a curse. Guards didn't need to say it aloud.
As the broader political climate shifted, rumors of change filtered through the camps. Stalin's death in 1953 sent shockwaves even into these remote places. Guards behaved differently. Administrators hesitated. Paperwork increased. For the first time in years, uncertainty worked in the prisoners' favor, but hope remained dangerous. Too many had learned that expecting relief often preceded collapse. Chapter 5 closes at the point where the story widens beyond individual suffering. The SS prisoners were no longer merely captives of war. They had become components of a vast system that blurred justice, vengeance, and necessity into something inseparable. What followed would not be defined solely by survival, but by memory, politics, and the slow reemergence of a world that had moved on without them. When the machinery of captivity finally began to slow, it did so unevenly, without announcement or clarity. Orders arrived that contradicted one another. Work quotas shifted. Entire camps were reorganized, merged, or quietly dissolved. For the SS prisoners, this period was more disorienting than any March or winter. They had learned how to survive certainty, even brutal certainty. What they did not know how to survive was ambiguity. Word spread that repatriations had begun, not for everyone and not quickly, but enough to fracture the emotional equilibrium of the camps. Men who had spent years suppressing hope now felt it surge back with dangerous force. Names appeared on lists, transports were assembled, then delayed, then canceled. Some prisoners were sent west, only to be rerouted deeper into the interior. Others vanished into administrative limbo, neither condemned nor released, simply held. For the SS prisoners, the criteria for release remained opaque. Unlike ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, whose mass repatriation accelerated after the late 1940s, they were subject to heightened scrutiny. Their pasts were examined repeatedly, sometimes by different authorities using different standards. A man cleared one year might be reinvestigated the next. Files were lost, rediscovered, reinterpreted. Guilt was not a fixed verdict. It was a status that could be reassigned. Those who were finally told they would be sent home often reacted not with joy, but with numb disbelief. Years of conditioning had taught them to expect reversal. The journey back was cautious, fragmented, conducted in stages that felt deliberately slow. Trains moved westward through landscapes that no longer resembled the world they remembered. Cities rebuilt, borders redrawn. Languages heard through open doors sounded familiar, yet foreign. The war had ended long ago, but its consequences were still rearranging lives. Return did not mean redemption. When SS prisoners crossed into Germany, many were not greeted at all. There were no bans, no ceremonies, no acknowledgement of endurance. They arrived thin, ill, prematurely aged, carrying documents that labeled them former enemies, former prisoners, former something that society did not want to confront. In both East and West Germany, silence awaited them. The country was busy reconstructing itself, morally as much as physically. There was little appetite for complicated stories. Families, when they existed, often struggled to recognize the men who returned. Years of absence had reshaped relationships. Children were grown. Wives had adapted or moved on. Parents had died, believing their sons lost forever. The returnees themselves carried habits shaped by captivity, hoarding food, avoiding crowds, sleeping lightly, speaking little. They had survived a system that punished visibility, and that instinct did not fade easily. Public memory offered no refuge. The SS designation closed doors rather than opened them. Some men hid their pasts entirely, claiming ordinary military service or avoiding discussion altogether. Others attempted to speak, only to find that their suffering was received with suspicion or outright hostility. The crimes of the SS were well known and rightly condemned. What society struggled to hold was the uncomfortable truth that perpetrators could also suffer, and that acknowledging suffering did not equal absolution. For historians, the fate of SS prisoners in Soviet captivity became a contested subject. Numbers debated, mortality rates recalculated, intent questioned. Was the system designed to punish, to extract labor, or both? Did indifference kill more than cruelty? The archives offered fragments rather than answers. Personal accounts contradicted official records. Memory collided with documentation, and certainty remained elusive. Yet what could not be denied was the scale of loss. Of the millions of German soldiers captured by the Soviets, a significant proportion never returned, and the SS prisoners were overrepresented among the dead. Disease, starvation, exposure, and exhaustion claimed them slowly, often without witnesses. Their names survive unevenly, preserved in family recollections, camp logs, or not at all. Chapter 6 ends not with closure, but with return stripped of triumph. For those who survived Soviet captivity, freedom arrived burdened with silence and ambiguity. They stepped back into a world that neither celebrated them nor mourned them, carrying a history that resisted simple judgment and refused to stay buried. Memory did not fade with distance. For many of the former SS prisoners, it sharpened after return, emerging in quiet rooms and sleepless nights. The camps followed them home in fragments, the sound of boots on frozen ground, the smell of thin soup, the weight of endless labor pressing into muscle and bone. These were not memories that fit neatly into public narratives of the war. They existed in isolation, carried privately, because speaking them aloud invited suspicion, anger, or outright rejection. In post-war Germany, identity itself became a battleground. The SS past marked men permanently, regardless of individual actions or degrees of responsibility. Even those who had been conscripts, clerks, or junior personnel found themselves trapped by the symbol of the uniform they once wore. Employers hesitated. Neighbors avoided questions by avoiding people. The silence surrounding their captivity was not only imposed from outside, but internalized. Many learned that survival depended on not being seen, not being known. Psychological damage manifested slowly. Years of regimented deprivation had reshaped how these men related to the world. Authority triggered reflexive obedience or sudden panic. Hunger never truly left, even when food was plentiful. Relationships strained under emotional distance that could not be easily explained. Some turned inward, retreating into routines that mimicked camp life because predictability felt safer than freedom. Others sought oblivion in alcohol or work, anything to quiet the persistent sense that survival had been conditional and could be revoked. The moral weight of memory complicated everything. Some former prisoners wrestled with guilt that had nothing to do with captivity itself. In the enforced stillness of the camps, there had been too much time to think. To remember, orders followed, moments ignored, choices made or avoided. Soviet imprisonment did not create this reckoning, but it intensified it. Labor and suffering became a grim mirror, forcing reflection without forgiveness. For others, denial hardened instead, becoming a protective shell against unbearable introspection. public discourse offered little guidance. In both German states, narratives of victimhood and responsibility were carefully managed. The suffering of civilians, the horrors of concentration camps, the crimes of the Nazi regime dominated, as they should have. There was no space carved out for the suffering of SS prisoners in Soviet captivity, nor was there consensus that such space should exist. To acknowledge it risked appearing to relativize or excuse atrocities. The result was a historical silence, filled only by private testimony. Historians who later attempted to study this chapter encountered resistance and contradiction. Soviet records were incomplete, selective, or inaccessible for decades. German sources were fragmented by shame and fear. Survivor accounts varied widely, shaped by memory, trauma, and self-preservation. Some exaggerated brutality, others minimized it. The truth lay unevenly between, resisting clean conclusions. What emerged instead was a pattern: prolonged captivity, high mortality, and a system that blurred retribution with economic necessity. This ambiguity has fueled ongoing debate. Were SS prisoners punished specifically for crimes or collectively for affiliation? Was forced labor a form of justice, exploitation, or both? Did the Soviet Union violate international norms, or did the unprecedented devastation it suffered redefine those norms in practice? These questions remain unresolved, not because evidence is absent, but because the moral terrain itself is fractured. Chapter 7 closes within this contested space, where memory, guilt, and history intersect without resolution. The story of SS prisoners in Soviet captivity does not end with release or return. It continues in the ways societies choose to remember, forget, or argue over the past, and in the uneasy recognition that suffering and culpability can coexist within the same human lives. As decades